Hey guys, this is WhytManga here with a new video. And in this video, I'm going to be explaining why for the past couple of videos I've been using mostly the microns. Most of this video is going to explain the differences between using a micron and using a G-Pen, which is what I usually use. And I'm going to be telling you guys the differences and giving you guys the pros and cons of using either a G-Pen or a Sakura Micron inking pen. For those who don't know me, I'm the creator of Apple Black. You can read the first 4 chapters of Apple Black free on Saturday AM, where Apple Black is published and serialized. Links to everything in the description. You can check out Apple Black, the first 4 chapters, or you can purchase Apple Black Volume 1, the first chapters from chapter 1 to 9. Volume 2 is on its way. I'll be explaining in a separate video. Yeah. Now, diving into this video, using the G-Pen. The main reason, the number one reason why I've kind of laid back on using the G-Pen is because of time. As you can see, you dip the pen. I'm holding the wooden nib, and then the G-Pen is the actual tip, and I'm dipping that into the ink, which was the Leader 6 ink. It was the Leader Black ink Type 6, and you kind of dip it, halfway-ish until the hole at the top of the nib, at the top of the G-Pen, is covered completely. And then there's a specific way you want to stroke the pen. You want to kind of stroke it in the opposite direction of that hole, facing upwards. And you want to find the sweet spot where your hand is most steady and comfortable. So you can see my hand's the most steady when I'm like stroking downwards or upwards, or like stroking at more accurate angles, more 90 degrees, or really up, down, left, right. Going at certain angles can be tricky at times, but yeah, I can make my hands curve a little bit. But one of the things you need to keep in mind as you're using the G-Pen is you have to be very, very patient. You can have some fast strokes sometimes, but even if you want to have fast strokes, there should be a really constant, smooth motion when you're using the G-Pen. And now, me being right-handed, when I draw, you want to make sure that you're drawing from the left to the right. That way, as you're inking, your hands wouldn't smudge the ink. Because if you're inking all over the place, there's a good chance the ink hasn't dried yet, because that's another thing, right? The ink doesn't dry immediately, so you don't want to smudge the ink. And this is ink, right? You can edit it after you scan it in and clean things up and stuff like that. But for the most part, if it's traditional art, the original art cannot be changed. That's it. It's ink, right? And you'd be stuck with that. So for the most part, you're inking. If you're left-handed, you'll be inking from the right to the left, and vice versa. So here, I'm stroking, finding that sweet spot, making sure that the circle at the top of the G-Pen is facing upwards, so we're not seeing the inner curve of the G-Pen. Like, the inner curve is like under. If you've used the G-Pen or you've seen me using the G-Pen before, you know what I'm talking about. But for the most part, where you see the G on the pen, it's facing upwards. I think that's the best way to say it. The G on the pen, it's kind of like not etched in, but there is like there's a sign on the actual nib itself of a G, and if the G is facing upwards, that's the way it should be positioned. And then you want to find the sweet spots of how you want to stroke. So you're having that smooth motion, inking from one side to the other based off of your drawing hand. So in this case, I'm right-handed, so we're inking from left to right. I'm drawing my character's hair here. The character I'm using in this video is the character I used in the previous video. In fact, this sketch is what I used from a previous video drawing a character's side view, like a profile view, and there's a video on that which I'll link to. But the character is Osamu from Apple Black, and I usually use my characters as models for my tutorials on this channel. So here, just doing the basic stuff. Again, sometimes what some people do is they burn the tip and maybe it helps the ink flow a little better. I don't usually do that. That's just not my thing. That's just not my thing. But some people say it works for them. You can like burn the tip, maybe with a lighter or something, and maybe the ink will flow a little faster for you. But again, you want to be patient. You don't want to rush things, because if you mess around too much, you can smudge. The thing with inking with a G pen is, when you ink with a G pen, once you're done, you kind of have to allow it dry. And for me, where I'm inking directly on the pencils, it has to dry completely before I go in with an eraser. Now you can use a light table and have a sketch paper. Put your original, put the main paper above it, and put them both under a light table, and you trace from there. But I'm drawing directly on my pencils, so I have to make sure it dries completely before I do anything with it. In fact, either way, you still have to do that. Whether you want to scan it, you don't want the scanner to get dirty with ink, so you have to allow the lines, the ink, dry up. But once they're dry, the pros with the G pen and the microns, once I get to them, is it's really compatible with Copic markers. So if you use markers, the alcohol, whatever, the base, whatever, the marker is not gonna smudge the lines once they're dry. So that's good. But you have to make sure you're using this particular ink. So inks have different characteristics, and I have a video talking about inks, and I'll link to that as well if you're interested. But if you're using the Leader 6 ink like I'm using here, and you're using a G pen to put it on, whether it's a G pen or not, it doesn't really matter when it comes to coloring, because the ink is the ink, right? I could have used a brush. As long as I'm using the Leader 6 ink, the Copic markers are not going to smudge with this, especially if they're dry. I mean, if they're not dry at all, then there's a problem. But as long as it's dry, it's not going to smudge. Copic markers work very well with these. From my experience working with G pens, they take a lot of time because you have to be extra patient. I think inking in general, you have to be patient because it's ink and it's permanent. But with with G pens, you have to be like extra patient. With your lines, you have to wait for it to dry. Sometimes the ink can dry to the tip of the pen, and if you notice, sometimes my hand goes off screen because I'm dipping it back into the ink to get everything wet again, and then I go back into the drawing. Sometimes it's actually best to take out the nib and clean it completely and then continue, rather than just dipping it in the ink straight away. I'm just doing that way in this video because I've been doing this a while and just experience in a way. But usually I'll run it under a tap or an empty sink, and I'll clean the nib and then kind of start dip it into the Leader 6 ink again and continue inking. Another thing I noticed when using the G pens, it's very difficult to use a ruler with them. I find myself, kind of using both a G pen and a micron when I'm doing my comics. So I use the G pen for more organic shapes and drawings and figures in the panels and stuff like that. But to draw like the panel lines, any straight lines at all, I almost always use a micron to do those. And again, when it comes to microns, I'll get to that in a sec. Now, sometimes when you if you start stroking too fast and the ink is kind of drying and sticking to the nib, some of your lines might struggle to show unless you're like a little slower, right? Your strokes with the nib are a little slower. Another thing is you want to keep track of because if you stroke, the tip, the lower end is going to be thinner than when you start, right? Your starting point is going to be thicker than your ending point. So you kind of want to make sure, let's say for the hairs, at the edges of the hair, I kind of make sure that I'm stroking the end part of the strokes are meeting. That's what's meeting, right? And not necessarily the starting point. Like when I'm using a G pen to ink, I don't like draw. I'm not like drawing. It's more you're stroking, because if you draw, say if you leave the tip at one spot too long, that the ink is just going to keep flowing at that spot, and it's going to leave a bubble or some kind of blurt, and it'll be harder for that spot to dry. One of the pros with using a G-Pen is that when you're using the G-Pen, it's pressure sensitive. I think microns are pressure sensitive as well, but not as much as the G-Pen. Like, I could make a really thick line with a G-Pen quickly, compared to, say, using a micron. With microns, you are more subjected to using the pens that you have. Now, with the microns I have, it goes from 005, 001, 005, 01, 02, 03, 05, and 08. 08 being the thickest and 005 being the thinnest. I usually use the 005 or the 01 to draw backgrounds, and I use everything else for more dynamic or organic drawings, or drawings that are closer to you. So usually when it comes to line variation, you want the thicker lines to be the lines closer to you, and the thinner ones to be the ones further away. And that's why I have the backgrounds in the 005 or the 01. What I'm using for my drawing here is a 01. I think the distance is pretty okay, and I'm kind of going to, so it's going to be a little constant. But for places that I want the lines to be thicker, I draw over that. Draw over those lines. I go over those lines over and over until I get exactly what I want. So with microns, sometimes you can find yourself going over and over just to make the lines feel more alive, to thicken the lines, or sometimes you would have to stop and switch pens. But generally, I still find using microns much faster for me, because here you don't have to worry about your hand orientation and drawing from one part to the other, because it's not going to smudge. You're not going to smudge anything. The lines are drying up as soon as they're hitting that paper, right? And now microns are also very compatible with Copic markers. They're not going to smudge with Copic markers. At least Sakura micron inking pens are not going to smudge with Copic markers. One of the cons using a G-Pen is that it also matters the paper. The paper you're using also matters a great deal. Now, the paper I'm using here is the Leader Type A B4 comic book paper. That's what it's called. It's the Leader Type A B4 comic book paper. And the paper is kind of smooth. It works very well with the G-Pen. See, the G-Pen has a really sharp end. So if, say, you were drawing stroking in like a regular sketchbook paper, sometimes the paper, the G-Pen could be scratching the paper, and then it will form like little paper balls in at the end. They'll get stuck to the end of the G-Pen, and therefore making the G-Pen almost turning it into a brush. And you don't want that, because then you're not in full control of how thin or thick your lines are. And that's why sometimes, even though the paper I'm using right now is good, to prevent this completely, you always, once in a while want to wash the G-Pen. Another thing with the G-Pen is very high maintenance. You don't want to leave it wet. You have to dry it. If you don't dry it, it can get rusty over time, and you don't want it rusty at all. And also, you don't want the ink to, like, after you ink, always clean it up, because if you don't, same thing, same issues. The G-Pen to me is the best when they're purchased, when you just get them. So another con with using the G-Pens is that they don't last as long as the microns, right? Once the G-Pen starts to get really dull, they become a pain to use. They become very difficult to use. So it's more expensive to use a G-Pen than a micron, because not only do you have to sometimes replace the G-Pen once it becomes dull, and it depending on how much you use it, it can get dull really quick. You also have to keep buying ink. So that's another thing, right? The ink doesn't last forever, especially if you're using the same ink for your brushes, maybe as I do when I brush and draw backgrounds and things like that. So it's more expensive to use a G-Pen. Now the G-Pen generally is the more popular one. It's used by most Japanese comic book creators in Japan for their own professional comics, but there are many professionals, especially here in the West, that use Sakura Microns to ink their drawings. But when it comes to manga, not that many. But even, you know, one of the most popular artists on YouTube here, Mark Crilly, uses a micron. So it's not, microns are also used by professionals. Generally, I find microns to just be easier to carry around. You know, you can only ink with the G-Pen if there's water around, so that you can rinse the nib when you need to. But things can get really messy. With microns, it's just like carrying a pen, so you can ink wherever you go, right? With the G-Pens, it's just a little more high maintenance. Microns are clearly cheaper and faster to use, but the thing with the G-Pen, I think the reason why G-Pens are still popular is because the end result is just slightly better than the microns. They just are. I don't know how to explain it unless you actually use both of them and you ink successfully with both. But you don't have to use G-Pens. When it comes to tools, I use what I'm comfortable with. So if you don't like G-Pens, you don't have to use G-Pens. You can use microns if that's what works for you. If that's what works for your comic, it's up to you completely. It's your comic. You figure it out. You don't have to use what everybody else is using. To sum it up, the G-Pen is basically a high maintenance girlfriend that's like really, really pretty. While the Sakura Micron is almost as pretty, but it's a little more chill girlfriend. For me, in my comic, the G-Pen is my, you could say, is my main girlfriend, and the Microns are my side chick. But personally, I just feel like G-Pens have a slightly better feel. And you can also feel them. Like, once you're done inking and you've erased the pencils, if you run your thumb or any of your fingers on the inks, and you close your eyes, you can feel the lines of a G-Pen compared to, say, a Micron, where it's just flat. All you feel is paper. It kind of gives the original inking or the original ink drawing just a little more character. Makes it feel a little more alive, you know. So again, with the Micron, another thing is you have to buy several Microns, and again, they're not as pressure sensitive, but you can still, if you have all the right pens and you've purchased them, they last longer. I guess based on how I use them and how long I use them, they last longer. And if you know what you're doing, you can achieve the same kind of lines that you would be able to achieve using a G-Pen, especially after when you scan it in, and then you can even play with the lines even further. You can, you know, fool people to think that there are lots of people who see my lines and think that I use a Micron. It's because you guys, and I use a G-Pen, sorry, but because you guys see my videos, you know I didn't use a G-Pen as much as I used to. Some of the problems is that, you know, you have people using the Microns and just drawing one thin line, and the lines just look a little too light. At least that's my opinion. Here's a quick example of, you know, erasing too early. There's a slight smudge under the ear, but I can feel those lines. With the Micron, you can't do that. Is it necessary? No, especially because the drawing is going to be scanned in anyways. But, you know, for original art, you can see why the G-Pen is probably more cherished and respected and all that stuff over the Microns. The pen brush tool that I use here in this video, I'll leave a link to where I actually use it for the first time, and y'all can check that out as well, so you know what pen brush I'm using. But sometimes I use an actual brush that I dip into the Deleter 6 to create, you know, sound effects or whatever I need to create at the time. So yeah, that's it for this video. I hope you guys enjoyed it. I hope you guys learned. a whole lot more about G-Pens and inks and Sakura microns and brushes and all that good stuff. And hope you guys come back for more to this channel. Subscribe if you haven't already. Again, more cool stuff coming. Please like this video, share this video so more people get to see it. I appreciate all the support I've gotten so far. And yeah, there's more to come. An announcement video is coming soon, where I announce, it's an announcement video. Just stay tuned. And yeah, that's it. WhytManga, and I'm out.